All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Today, before we get into the book, we're going to check out The Thing listening device. Now, this is kind of interesting because obviously the whole time McCarthyism was going on, the Soviets had a listening device inside the United States Embassy in the Soviet Union, so kind of ironic a little bit. I don't know if it's ironic or some other word, but we'll just read a little bit of this. The Thing, also known as the Great Seal Bug, was one of the first covert listening devices or bugs to use passive techniques to transmit an audio signal. It was concealed inside a gift given by the Soviet Union to W. Averell Harriman, the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union on August 4th, 1945. Because it was passive, needing electromagnetic energy from an outside source to become energized and active, it is considered a predecessor of radio frequency identification (RFID) technology. Basically, it had a tiny little antenna in it that vibrated, and then they had to hit it with basically like a radio frequency to bounce off of it, and then they could hear through a receiver, basically. Now, it's interesting that it was actually invented by Leon Theremin, which is the guy that invented the theremin, which is like the sci-fi sound effect instrument that's like woo, woo, like he invented that, which is like the first synthesizer, and technically it's the only instrument in the world that you don't have to touch to play it. So it's kind of interesting. The Soviets invented synthesizers. Actually, it's kind of funny because it's one of those things. I was going to make a video on like mistaken inventions, and that's one of the mistaken inventions where they actually thought that they were going to make some type of like sound weapon, and then they ended up inventing 80s music instead. Kind of cool. So basically, a pilot flying by who had their channel open to a Soviet channel just happened to hear by accident the same thing when they were hitting the receiver with the signal. He was able to receive the same signal. And then they had to go and do a sweep of all of the embassy buildings in order to find the bug. Then, of course, the CIA came around, copied exactly what they were doing, and then put it in a bunch of other stuff, of course. They were like, oh, this is a great idea. We got to do this now to spy on people. That's the CIA. Okay. So here's the thing itself. So the whole time McCarthyism was going on, the Russians were just like right inside the U.S. Embassy in the Soviet Union listening to everything. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. All right. Gonna get into the book. Nuclear Rivalry and the Cold War, 1945 to 1950. On page 932. I guess it's the second paragraph down. One second. All right. McCarthy repeated this performance before a Senate subcommittee chaired by Senator Millard Tydings of Maryland a few weeks later. From March 7th through early July, this subcommittee of Senate Foreign Relations Committee took 1,500 printed pages of testimony, plus more than 1,000 pages of documentation. McCarthy's testimony, it soon developed, was based entirely on evidence turned up by the House of Representatives Committee of the previous Congress. He gave names to the 66 cases. He called it 81 cases he had mentioned in the Senate speech and 35 new names. In few cases was there any evidence. When asked for evidence, he airily told Senator Teitig that that was his job. The evidence was in the State Department, and it was up to the committee to get it. After the files in question were obtained by the committee and found to contain no evidence to support McCarthy's charges, McCarthy called them phony files and insisted that they had been raped and rifled of the FBI reports which had been in them. J. Edgar Hoover was called in. He had the files examined and reported that the State Department files were intact. McCarthy ignored this rebuff. New charges followed. Eventually, he announced that he would base his whole reputation on one case. For more than a week, he tantalized the world and the committee by withholding the name. The top Russian espionage agent in the United States, Alger Hiss's boss in the espionage ring in the State Department. The chief architect of our Far Eastern policy. At last, the name was released. Professor Owen Lattimore of Johns Hopkins University, the English-speaking world's greatest authority on Mongolia. The only trouble was that Lattimore was not a communist, not a spy, and not employed by the State Department. The Teitig Subcommittee report, issued in July, condemned McCarthy for a fraud and a hoax on the Senate. Starting with nothing, Senator McCarthy plunged headlong forward, desperately seeking to develop some information. McCarthy should have been finished. He was not. And for a very simple reason. In politics, truth is not so important as power, and McCarthy soon showed that he had the power and the power of an inflamed and misled public opinion. That he had the power of an inflamed and misled public opinion. Okay. In the election of November 1950, several members of the Senate who had been most outspoken against McCarthy, including some of the most influential leaders of that august body, were defeated by McCarthyism, if not by McCarthy. Teitig was beaten in Maryland in 1950, and Scott Lucas, the Democratic leader in the Senate who had harassed McCarthy during his performance on February 20th, went down with him. William Benton, senator from Connecticut, who introduced a resolution to expel McCarthy from the Senate in 1951, and whose charges were fully supported by the Senate's investigation of McCarthy's private finances, was defeated in 1952. With him, went down to defeat Lucas's successor as Democratic leader, Senator McFarland of Arizona. From 1950 to 1954, most of his fellow senators and many in the executive branch were terrorized by McCarthy's power with the electorate and opposed him on nothing they could possibly concede. During this period, he violated more laws and regulations than any previous senator in history. Thousands of his secret supporters in the administration sent him information and misinformation, classified secrets, spite letters, anonymous notes. The Eisenhower administration at one time considered charging McCarthy himself with espionage, but did not have the courage. Much of this material was read by McCarthy over nationwide television broadcast. When a reporter once said to him, "Isn't that a classified document?" McCarthy said. "It was. I just declassified it." It may be doubted that McCarthy's power to defeat his enemies was as great as they thought, but he encouraged these thoughts. Certainly he defeated Tydings. Senator Tydings, from an old and wealthy Maryland family with a brilliant combat record in World War I, was too conservative for Franklin Roosevelt, who tried to purge him in the primary campaign of 1938, but had been soundly rebuffed. McCarthy did it differently. Using the large sums of money which came to him from real anti-communists throughout the country, McCarthy hired a group of shady characters led by an ex-FBI agent fired for immorality during enforcement of the man-white slave law, and sent them, well equipped with funds, into Maryland to fight Tydings as a pro-communist. The state election laws were violated on a wholesale basis, including excess expenditures, forgery, use of out-of-state paid campaigners, and numerous other violations. The coup de grace was administered to Tydings by wide circulation of faked photographs of Tydings and communist leader Earl Browder cozily together, a concoction of McCarthy's staff. Damn, they were doing deep fakes all the way in 1950. After Tydings was defeated, several of his victorious opponent's staff, including his campaign manager, were tried and sentenced to jail or to pay fines for electoral law violations, but that did not change the result of the election, and few other senators wanted to risk the same ordeal by opposing McCarthy in the Senate. The Republicans were as scared as the Democrats, and with good reason, for party lines, like all other distinctions, meant nothing to McCarthy, and he continued his charges in 1953 to 1954 with his own party in control of both houses of Congress and Eisenhower in the White House. The chief change was that he stopped talking of 20 years of treason in the White House and talked of 21 years of treason. The new president, in an effort to divert these attacks, continued to yield to him as he had yielded to him during the campaign. The administration was soon boasting that 1,456 federal workers had been separated in the first 4 months of the Eisenhower security program. At the end of the first year, the president raised his total to 2,200. It took some weeks for the Democrats to discover that these figures did not apply to subversives or even to security risks, but to anyone who left the government service. By the end of its first year, the new administration adopted completely McCarthy's refusal to be hampered by categories. President Nixon said, "We're kicking the communists and fellow travelers and security risks out of the government by the thousands." Kind of like the self-deportation thing. It's like, oh, well, they just left work, but now they're communists. It was soon clear that no known communists were kicked out and that security risks included all kinds of persons, such as those who were imbibed too freely at Washington's endless cocktail parties. A communist in the State Department would have been a prize amongst this motley crew, but none was announced. For a while, the new administration tried to outdo McCarthy, chiefly by demonstrating in committee hearings that China had been lost to the communists because of careful planning and intrigue of communists in the State Department. The chief effort in this direction was done by a well-organized and well-financed China lobby radiating from activities of Alfred Kohlberg, a wealthy exporter who had business interests in China. This group, with its allies, such as McCarthy, mobilized a good deal of evidence that communists had infiltrated into various academic, journalistic, and research groups concerned with the Far East. but they failed to prove their contention that a conspiracy of these communists and fellow travelers acting through the State Department had given China to Mao. Mao won out in China because of the incompetence and corruption of the Chiang Kai-shek regime, and he won out in spite of any aid the United States gave or could give to Chiang, because the latter's regime was incapable of holding out against Mao without drastic reforms, whatever the scale of American aid, without American military intervention to make war on Mao, which very few desired. The China lobby's version was based on two contentions. One, that there were communist insignificant positions close to the agencies which helped to form American academic and public opinion on the Far East, and two, that there were frequent agreements between known communists and known formulators of American policy and opinion on China. This whole subject is too complex for adequate discussion here, but the situation must be outlined. There is considerable truth in the China lobby's contention that the American experts on China were organized into a single interlocking group which had a general consensus of leftist character. It is also true that this group, from its control of funds, academic recommendations, and research or publication opportunities, could favor persons who accepted the established consensus and could injure, financially or in a professional advancement, persons who did not accept it. It is also true that the established group, by its influence on book reviewing in the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, the Saturday Review, a few magazines, including the liberal weeklies, and in the professional journals, could advance or hamper any specialist's career. It is also true that these things were done in the United States in regard to the Far East by the Institute of Pacific Relations. That this organization had been infiltrated by communists and by communist sympathizers, and that much of this group's influence arose from its access to control over the flow of funds from financial foundations to scholarly activities. It's another one of those round table groups. All these things were true, but they would have been true of any other areas of American scholarly research and academic administration in the United States, such as Near East studies or anthropology or educational theory or political science. They were more obvious in regard to the Far East because of the few persons and the bigger issues involved in that area. On the other hand, the charges of the China lobby, accepted and proliferated by the neo-isolationists in the 1950s and by the radical right in the 1960s, that China was lost because of this group, or that the members of this group were disloyal to the United States, or engaged in espionage, or were participants in a conscious plot, or that the whole group was controlled by Soviet agents or even by communists, is not true. Yet the whole subject is of major importance in understanding the 20th century. Yeah, they weren't spies, because that was the actual plan, was to build up China as a communist country so that they could export all the jobs there. In the first place, because of language barriers, the number of people who could be experts on the Far East was limited. Most of these, like Pearl Buck, Professor Fairbank of Harvard, or Professor Latourette and Rowe of Yale, and many others, were children or relatives of people who originally became concerned with China as missionaries. This gave them a double character. They learned the language and they had feelings of spiritual mission about China. When we add to this that they were, until after 1950, few in numbers and had access, because of the commercial importance of the Far East, to relatively large amounts of research, travel, and publication funds on Far East matters, they almost inevitably came to form a small group who knew each other personally, met fairly regularly, had a fairly established consensus based on conversations and reading each other's books on Far East questions, and generally had certain characteristics of a clique. Lattimore, for example, because he knew Mongolian and the others did not, tended to become everybody's expert on Mongolia, was rarely challenged on Mongolia or northwest interior China, and inevitably became rather opinionated, if not conceited, on the subject. Moreover, many of these experts, and those the ones which were favored by the Far East establishment, in the Institute of Public Relations, were captured by communist ideology. Under its influence, they propagandized as experts erroneous ideas and sought to influence policy in mistaken directions. For example, they sought to establish in 1943 to 1950 that the Chinese communists were simple agrarian reformers, rather like the third party groups of the American Midwest, or that Japan was evil and must be totally crushed, the monarchy removed, and later that American policy in Japan under General MacArthur was a failure. They even accepted on occasion the Stalinist line that communist regimes were democratic and peace loving, while capitalist ones were warlike and aggressive. For example, as late as 1951, the John Day Company, Richard J. Walsh president, published an indictment of MacArthur's policies in Japan by Robert Textor. The book, called Failure in Japan, had an introduction by Lattimore and sought to show that our occupation policy led to failure for democratic values in Japan and a situation of strategic weakness for the West. This childish libel was propagated by the IPR, which mailed out 2,300 postcards advertising the book. Behind this unfortunate situation lies another, more profound relationship which influences matters much broader than Far Eastern policy. It involves the organization of tax exempt fortunes of international financiers into foundations to be used for educational, scientific, and other public purposes. 60 or more years ago, public life in the West was dominated by the influence of Wall Street. This term has nothing to do with its use by the communists to mean monopolistic industrialism, but on the contrary, it refers to international financial capitalism deeply involved in the gold standard, foreign exchange fluctuations, floating of fixed interest securities, and, to a lesser extent, flotation of industrial shares for stock exchange markets. This group, which in the United States was completely dominated by J.P. Morgan and Company from the 1880s to the 1930s, was cosmopolitan, Anglophile, internationalist, Ivy League, Eastern Seaboard, high Episcopalian, and European culture conscious. Their connection with the Ivy League colleges rested on the fact that the large endowments of these institutions required constant consultation with the financiers of Wall Street or its lesser branches on State Street, Boston, and elsewhere, and was reflected in the fact that these endowments, even in 1930, were largely in bonds rather than in real estate or common stocks. As a consequence of these influences, as late as the 1930s, J.P. Morgan and his associates were the most significant figures in policy making at Harvard, Columbia, and to a lesser extent Yale, while the Whitneys were significant at Yale and the Prudential Insurance Company, through Edward D. Duffield, dominated Princeton. The names of these Wall Street luminaries still adorn these Ivy League campuses, with Harkness College and Payne Whitney Gymnasium at Yale, the Pine Dormitory at Princeton, a Dillon Fieldhouse, a Lamont Library at Harvard. The chief officials of these universities were beholden to these financial powers and usually owed their jobs to them. Morgan himself Morgan himself helped make Nicholas Murray Butler president of Columbia. His chief Boston agent, Thomas Nelson Perkins of the First National Bank of that city, gave Conant his boost from the chemical laboratory to University Hall at Harvard. Duffield of Prudential, caught unprepared when the incumbent president of Princeton was killed in an automobile in 1932, made himself president for a year before he chose Harold Dodds for the post in 1933. At Yale, Thomas Lamont, managing partner of the Morgan firm, was able to swing Charles Seymour into the presidency of that university in 1937. The significant influence of Wall Street, meaning Morgan, both in the Ivy League and in Washington in the period of 60 or more years following 1880 explains the constant interchange between the Ivy League and the federal government, an interchange which undoubtedly aroused a good deal of resentment in less favored circles, who were more than satiated with the accents, tweeds, and high Episcopal Anglophilia of these people. Poor Dean Aikson, in spite of, or perhaps because of, his remarkable qualities of intellect and character, took the full brunt of this resentment from McCarthy and his allies in 1948 to 1954. The same feeling did no good to pseudo-Ivy League figures like Alger Hiss. Because of its dominant position in Wall Street, the Morgan firm came also to dominate other Wall Street powers such as Carnegie, Whitney, Vanderbilt, Brown, Harriman, or Dillon Reed. Close alliances were made with Rockefeller, Mellon, and Duke interests, but not nearly so intimate ones with the great industrial powers like DuPont and Ford. In spite of the great influence of this Wall Street alignment, an influence great enough to merit the name of the American establishment, this group could not control the federal government and, in consequence, had to adjust to any good many government decisions thoroughly distasteful to the group. The chief of these were in taxation law, beginning with the graduated income tax in 1913, but culminating, above all else, in the inheritance tax. These tax laws drove the great private fortunes dominated by Wall Street into tax-exempt foundations, which became a major link in the establishment network between Wall Street, the Ivy League, and the federal government. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State after 1961, formerly president of the Rockefeller Foundation and Rhodes Scholar at Oxford 1931 to 1933, is as much a member of this nexus as Alger Hiss, the Dulles brothers, Jerome Green, James T. Shotwell, John W. Davis, Elu Root, or Philip Jessup. More than 50 years ago, the Morgan firm decided to infiltrate the left-wing political movements in the United States. This was relatively easy to do since these groups were starved for funds and eager for a voice to reach the people. Wall Street supplied both. The purpose was not to destroy, dominate, or take over, but was really threefold. 1. To keep informed about the thinking of left-wing or liberal groups. 2. To provide them with a mouthpiece so that they could blow off steam. And 3. To have a final veto on their publicly and possibly on their actions if they ever went radical. There was nothing really new about this decision, since other financiers had talked about it, even attempted it earlier. What made it decisively important this time was the combination of its adoption by the dominant Wall Street financier at a time when tax policy was driving all financiers to seek tax-exempt refuges for their fortunes, and at a time when the ultimate in left-wing radicalism was about to appear under the banner of the Third International. All right, so that's definitely the whole controlled opposition concept right there, where they're funding the left-wing stuff just to keep an eye on it, just to make sure those lefties don't bring in too much. Gotta let them blow off some steam, kind of like the protests, right? Gotta let the lefties blow off some steam before we completely screw the economy again. The best example of this alliance of Wall Street and left-wing publications was the New Republic, a magazine founded by Willard Straight using Payne Whitney money in 1914. Straight, who had been assistant to Robert H. Hart, director of the Chinese Imperial Customs Service and the head of the European imperialist penetration of China, and had remained in the Far East from 1901 to 1912, became a Morgan partner and the firm's chief expert on the Far East. He married Dorothy Payne Whitney, whose names indicate the family's alliance of the two of America's greatest fortunes. She was the daughter of William C. Whitney, New York utility millionaire, and the sister and co-heiress of Oliver Payne of the Standard Oil Trust. One of her brothers married Gertrude Vanderbilt, while the other, Payne Whitney, married the daughter of the Secretary of State, John Hay, who enunciated the American policy of the open door in China. In the next generation, three first cousins, John Hay, Jock Whitney, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Sonny Whitney, and Michael Whitney, Mike Straight, were allied in numerous public policy enterprises of a propagandist nature, and all three served in varied roles in the late New Deal and Truman administrations. In these, they were closely allied with the other Wall Street liberals, such as Nelson Rockefeller. The New Republic was founded by Willard and Dorothy Straight using her money in 1914 and continued to be supported by her financial contributions until March 23, 1953. But I thought women weren't allowed to have money or jobs. The original purpose for establishing the paper was to provide an outlet for the progressive left and to guide it quietly in an Anglophile direction. This later task was entrusted to a young man only 4 years out of Harvard, but already a member of the mysterious Round Table Group, which has played a major role in directing England's foreign policy since its formal establishment in 1909. This new recruit, Walter Lippmann, had been, from 1914 to present, the authentic spokesman in American journalism for the establishments on both sides of the Atlantic in international affairs. His bi-weekly columns, which appear in hundreds of American papers, are copyrighted by the New York Herald Tribune, which is now owned by J.H. Whitney. It was these connections, as a link between Wall Street and the Round Table Group, which gave Lippmann the opportunity in 1918, while still in his 20s, to be the official interpreter of the meaning of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points to the British government. Willard Straight, like many Morgan agents, was present at the Paris Peace Conference, but died there of pneumonia before it began. 6 years later, in 1925, when his widow married a second time and became Lady Elmhurst of Dartington Hall, she took her three small children from America to England, where they were brought up as English. She herself renounced her American citizenship in 1935. Shortly afterwards, her younger son, Mike, unsuccessfully stood for Parliament on the Labour Party ticket for the constituency of Cambridge University, an act which required under law that he be a British subject. This proved no obstacle in 1938 when Mike, aged 22, returned to the United States after 13 years in England and was at once appointed to the State Department as advisor on international economic affairs. In 1937, apparently in preparation for her son's return to America, Lady Elmhurst, sole owner of the New Republic, shifted this ownership to Westrim Limited, a dummy corporation created for the purpose in Montreal, Canada, and set up in New York with a grant of $1.5 million, the William C. Whitney Foundation, of which Mike became president. This helped finance the family's interest in modern art and dramatic theater, including Sister Beatrix's tours as a Shakespearean actress. Mike Strait served in the Air Force in 1943 to 1945, but this did not in any way hamper his career with the New Republic. He became Washington correspondent in May 1941, editor in June 1943, and publisher in December 1946, when he made Henry Wallace editor. During these shifts, he changed completely the control of the New Republic and its companion magazine, Asia, removing known liberals such as Robert Morse Lovett, Malcolm Cowley, and George Soule, centralizing the control and taking it into his own hands. This control by Whitney money had, of course, always existed, but it had been in abeyance for the 25 years following Willard Strait's death. The first editor of the New Republic, the well-known liberal Herbert Croly, was always aware of the situation. After 10 years in the job, he explained the relationship in the official biography of Willard Straight, which he wrote for the payment of $25,000. Of course, the Straits, could always withdraw their financial support if they ceased to approve of the policy of the paper, and in that event, it would go out of existence as a consequence of their disapproval. This is how things really work, people. It's not like, oh, the free market just chooses who's the best person. No, that's not how it actually works. Crowley's biography of Strait, published in 1924, makes perfectly clear that Strait was in no sense a liberal or progressive, but was, indeed, a typical international banker, and that the New Republic was simply a medium for advancing certain designs of such international bankers, notably to blunt the isolationism and anti-British sentiments so prevalent among many American progressives, while providing them with a vehicle for expression of their progressive views in literature, art, music, and social reform, and even domestic policies. So they push liberal policies on the U.S., right? Changing the art, changing the music, social reforms, and policies. But at the same time, they don't believe in it. They're like hyper conservative, super rich people, right? In 1916, when the editorial board wanted to support Wilson for a second term in the presidency, Willard Straight took 2 pages of the magazine to express his own support for Hughes. The chief advancement of the New Republic, however, in 1914 to 1918 and again in 1938 to 1948 was for interventionism in Europe and support of Great Britain. Oh yeah, they also want you to die in wars, too. The role of Mike Strait in this situation in 1938 to 1948 is clear. He took charge of this family fief, abolished the editorial board, and carried on his father's aims in close cooperation with labor and left-wing groups in American politics. In these efforts, he was in close contact with his inherited Wall Street connections, especially his Whitney cousins and certain family agents like Bruce Bliven, Milton C. Rose, and Richard J. Walsh. They handled a variety of enterprises, including publications, corporations, and foundations, which operated out of the law office of Baldwin, Todd, and Lefferts of 120 Broadway, New York City. In this nexus were the New Republic, Asia, Theater Arts, the Museum of Modern Art, and others, all supported by a handful of foundations, including the William C. Whitney Foundation, the Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney Foundation, the J. H. Whitney Foundation, and others. An interesting addition was made to these enterprises in 1947 when Strait founded a new magazine, the United Nations World, to be devoted to the support of the UN. Its owners of record were the New Republic itself under its corporate name, Nelson Rockefeller, J. H. Whitney, Max Ascoli, an anti-fascist Italian who had married American wealth and used it to support a magazine of his own, The Reporter, and Beatrice S. Dolvett. The last lady, Mike Straight's sister, made her husband, Louis Dolvett, international editor of the new magazine. An important element in this nexus was Asia Magazine, which had been established by Morgan's Associates as the Journal of the American Asiatic Society in 1898, had been closely associated with Willard Strait during his lifetime, and was owned outright by him from January 1917. In the 1930s, it was operated for the Whitneys by Richard J. Walsh and his wife, known to the world as Pearl Buck. Walsh, who acted as editor of Asia, was also president of the holding corporation of the New Republic for several years and president of the John Day Publishing Company. In 1942, after Nelson Rockefeller and Jock Whitney joined the government to take charge of American propaganda in Latin America in the office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, Asia Magazine changed its name to Asia and the Americas. In 1947, when Mike Strait began a drive to sell the United Nations, it was completely reorganized into United Nations World. So notice how they're pushing China on us through the United Nations because they knew that they wanted to do all this stuff to export all the jobs, and it's crazy. Mike Strait was deeply anti-communist, but he frequently was found associated with them, sometimes as a collaborator, frequently as an opponent. The opposition was seen most clearly in his efforts as one of the founders of the American Veterans Committee, AVC, and its political sequel, the Americans for Democratic Action, ADA. The collaboration may be seen in Strait's fundamental role in Henry Wallace's third-party campaign for the presidency in 1948. The relationship between Strait and the communists and pushing Wallace into his 1948 adventure may be misjudged very easily. The anti-communist right had a very simple explanation of it. Wallace and Strait were communists and hoped to elect Wallace president. Nothing could be further from the truth. All three, Strait, Wallace, and the communists, joined in the attempt merely as a means of defeating Truman. Strait was the chief force in getting the campaign started in 1947 and was largely instrumental in bringing some of the communists into it. But when he had them all aboard the Wallace train, he jumped off himself, leaving both Wallace and the communists gliding swiftly, without guidance or hope, on the downhill track to oblivion. It was a brilliantly done piece of work. The communists wanted a third party in 1948 because it seemed the only way to beat Truman and destroy the Marshall Plan. They hated the president for the Truman Doctrine and his general opposition to the Soviet Union, but, above all, because he had prevented the post-war economic collapse and the American relapse into isolationism, both of which the communists had not only expected but critically needed. It was obvious to everyone that the two-party campaign in 1948 would give the vote of the right to the Republicans and the vote of the left to the Democrats, with the victory decided by where the division came in the center. In such a situation, neither Straight nor the Communists could influence the outcome in any way, but a third party on the left, by taking labor and other left-wing votes from Truman, could reduce the Democratic totals in the major states enough to throw those states and the elections to the Republicans. Why Straight wanted to do this in the critical months from September 1946 to April 1948 is unknown, but he clearly changed his mind in the spring of 1948, abandoning poor, naive Henry Wallace to the Communists at that time. A possible explanation of these actions won't be given later. What is clear is that Mike Straight had a great deal to do with Wallace in autumn of 1946, when the former vice president broke with Truman and was fired from the cabinet. The break came over a Wallace speech, very critical of American policy towards Russia, given before a wildly biased pro-Soviet audience in Madison Square Garden on September 12, 1946. At the time, Truman told reporters he had approved the speech before delivery, a version which Wallace still upholds, but within a few days, Secretary of State Brines forced the president to make a choice between him or Wallace, and the latter was dismissed from the cabinet. Out of the government, without a platform from which to address the public, Wallace's political future looked dim in the early autumn of 1946. They didn't have Rumble back then. Straight provided the platform by giving him his own editorial chair at the New Republic, announced October 12, 1946. For the next 15 months, the Wallace campaign was a Straight campaign. The latter supplied speechwriters, research assistants, editorial writers, office space, money, and the New Republic itself. Technically, Wallace was editor, but the magazine's staff and expenditures steadily increased in directions which had little to do with the magazine and everything to do with Wallace's presidential campaign, although this effort was not announced to the public until a year later, in December 1947. In the meantime, from the spring of 1947 onward, the Communists came in. It would not be strictly true to say that Straight brought them in, but I believe it is fair to say that he let them in. For example, one of the first to arrive was Lou Frank Jr., brought in by Straight, who later insisted that he did not realize that Frank was a communist. As a matter of fact, there was no evidence that Frank was a member of the Communist Party, but Straight knew exactly where Frank stood politically, since they had engaged on opposite sides in a bitter struggle between communists and anti-communists for control of AVC. In this, Frank had been a member of the Communist Caucus within AVC's National Planning Committee, as Straight told David A. Shannon in 1956, and followed every twist of the party line in this whole period. This party line became the pattern for Wallace's formal speeches, since Frank was his most important speechwriter over a period of 18 months from early 1947 to October 1948. More than this, Frank accompanied Wallace on his endless travels during the period. In the autumn of 1947, these three, Wallace, Frank, and Straight, made a trip to the Mediterranean and were given an audience together by the Pope on November 4th, 1947. On his return from this journey, Wallace was a changed man. His mind was made up to run against Truman on a third-party ticket. The announcement was made public in the New Republic in December. Straight continued to work for Wallace for president, and the New Republic remained the center of the movement for almost 4 months. But something had changed. While He was still working for Wallace as president and allowing the communists into the project. He was simultaneously doing two other things: working openly and desperately to prevent the new third party from campaigning on any level other than the presidential, by blocking everywhere he could communist efforts to run third party candidates for state or congressional offices in competition with the Democrats. Much less publicly, he worked with his anti communist friends in labor, veteran, and liberal groups to prevent endorsements of the Wallace candidacy. As a consequence, the communists were destroyed and eventually driven out of such organizations, notably from the CIO-PAC, the Great Political Alignment of Labor and Progressive Groups. As David Shannon wrote in The Decline of American Communism in 1959, the communist support of Wallace shattered the left-center coalition in the CIO. For the communist unions, the Wallace movement was the beginning of the end. The coalition began to dissolve almost immediately after Wallace's announcement. What this means is that Wallace's campaign to defeat Truman destroyed completely the remaining vestiges of the Popular Front movement of the 1930s, drove the communists out of the unions and all progressive political groups, and drove the communist unions out of the labor movement of the country. This ended communism as a significant political force in the United States, and the end was reached by December 1948, long before McCarthy or J. Edgar Hoover or the HUAC did their work. The men who achieved this feat were Wallace and Strait, although it is still not completely clear if they recognized what they were doing. During the winter of 1947 to 1948, Lou Frank recognized that he was incapable of handling the complex issues raised in Wallace's many speeches. Accordingly, he joined a communist research group which met in the Manhattan home of the wealthy Wall Street Red Frederick Vanderbilt Field. The chief members of this group, probably all communist, were Victor Perlo and David Ramsey. This pair drew up for Wallace an attack on the Marshall Plan and an alternative communist plan for European reconstruction, which was published in the New Republic on January 12, 1948, was presented by Wallace to the Marshall Plan hearings of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on February 24th, but was subsequently repudiated by Strait. In the 3 months following the Perlo article, Strait was busy sawing off the limb on which Wallace now sat with the communists. He discharged from the New Republic payroll all those who were working for the campaign rather than for the magazine, and the office on East 49th Street once again settled down to publishing a liberal weekly. In protest at this reversal, his managing editor, Ed Johnson, resigned. If Mike Strait planned to do what he did do to the communists in 1946 to 1948, that is, to get them out of progressive movements and unions, he pulled off the most skillful political coup in the 20th century American politics. It is not clear that he did plan it or intend it, but as a very able and informed man, he must have had some motivation when he began in 1947 the effort which he knew might defeat Truman in 1948. While the evidence is not conclusive, there are hints that another, more personal motive might have been involved, at least partly, in building up the Wallace threat to Truman's political future. It concerns the Whitney family's interest in overseas airlines. The Whitney family were deeply involved in airlines. Sonny Whitney was the founder of Pan American Airlines and chairman of its board of directors from its establishment in 1928 until he went into military service in 1941. Mike's brother, Air Commodore Whitney Willard Strait, CBE, was even more involved on the British side. Big Brother Whitney, born 1912, had been in civil aviation in England from the age 22, and by 1946 to 1949 was not only a director of the Midland Bank, one of the world's greatest financial institutions, but was also a director of Rolls-Royce and BOAC, as well as chairman of the board of directors of British European Airways. In the years following the end of the war, a violent struggle was going on within aviation circles and the United States government over the future of American transocean air services. Before the war, these had been a monopoly of Pan Am. Now, at the end of the war, the struggle was over how the CAB would divide up this monopoly and what disposition would be made of the enormous Air Force investment in overseas bases. Apparently, the White House was not cooperative in these matters at first, but late in 1947, C.V. Whitney was made, by presidential interim appointment, Assistant Secretary of the new Department of the Air Force, and 18 months later, after Truman's inauguration, was made Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Aeronautics. This was the most important post concerned with civil aviation in any federal department. The connection, if any, between these appointments and Mike Strait's original support and later abandonment of Wallace has never been revealed. So basically, the guy that owns the biggest airline also became in charge of the Secretary of Commerce, so he could make up whatever rules he wanted for his. See, this is what I'm saying. It's like the government doesn't actually work when the people that are in charge are also the people that own everything. So then they just make up the rules so that it benefits only them, right? They're like, oh, wait, no one else can build a plane but me, and I just happen to run all the laws for how many people can have planes and who can fly planes and where you can fly planes, and I also own America's largest private plane corporation. It's ridiculous. The association between Wall Street and the left, of which Mike Strait is a fair example, are rarely survivals of the associations between the Morgan Bank and the left. To Morgan, all political parties were simply organizations to be used, and the firm always was careful to keep a foot in all camps. So people are like, oh, they're not playing both sides. The left is seriously the problem. You guys got to focus on the left because they're seriously the problem, not the right. And then the left's like, oh, you got to focus on the right because they're really the problem. Don't focus on the rich people and the politicians making all the laws. Never do that. Focus on the poor people in the street that could barely make it day to day. Focus on them. They're the real evil in the country. Not these people appointing themselves into offices to make sure that only they can make money. And then they'll turn around and call you poor. And say, oh, well, why can't you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, bro? All you have to do is just form a military, take over the entire country, and then that's how it works, right? Your family just had to have been rich 400 years ago before they invented automatic weapons. And then you could have just bought into the buying all the automatic weapons, and then you could have been in charge of Europe. It's that simple, bro. It's that simple, It's really easy. Just buy a couple Bitcoin, and then you can become a world leader. Morgan himself, Dwight Morrow, and other partners were allied with Republicans. Russell C. Leftingwell was allied with the Democrats, Grayson Murphy was allied with the extreme right, and Thomas W. Lamont was allied with the left. Like the Morgan interest in libraries, museums, and art, its inability to distinguish between loyalty to the United States and loyalty to England, its recognition of the need for social work among the poor, the multipartisan political views of the Morgan firm in domestic politics went back to the original founder of the firm, George Peabody, 1795 to 1869. To this same seminal figure may be attributed the use of tax-exempt foundations for controlling these activities, as may be observed in many parts of America to this day, in the use of the Peabody Foundations to support Peabody libraries and museums. Unfortunately, we do not have space here for this great and untold story, but it must be remembered that what we do say is part of a much larger picture. Our concern at the moment is with the links between Wall Street and the left, especially the communist. Here, the chief link was Thomas W. Lamont family. This family was in many ways parallel to the Straight family. Tom Lamont had been brought into the Morgan firm, as Straight was several years later, by Henry P. Davidson, a Morgan partner from 1909. Lamont became a partner in 1910 as Straight did in 1913. Each had a wife who became a patroness of leftish causes and two sons, of which the elder was a conventional banker and the younger was a left-wing sympathizer and sponsor. In fact, all the evidence would indicate that Tom Lamont was simply Morgan's apostle to the left in succession to Straight, a change made necessary by the latter's premature death in 1918. Both were financial supporters of liberal publications, in Lamont's case, the Saturday Review of Literature, which he supported throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and the New York Post, which he owned from 1918 to 1924. The chief evidence, however, can be found in the files of the HUAC, which show Tom Lamont, his wife Flora, and his son Corliss as sponsors and financial angels to almost a score of extreme left organizations, including the Communist Party itself. So, the largest capitalists in America were sponsoring the Communist Party. Like, how many times do we have to keep going over this before people stop saying that, oh, look at it's the left, man. The left is really what's the problem. Among these, we need to mention only two. One of these was a communist front organization, the Trade Union Services Incorporated of New York City, which in 1947 published 15 trade union papers for various CIO unions. Among its officers were Corliss and Frederick Vanderbilt Field, another link between Wall Street and communists. Okay, let's just put a post-it note there just so we can see how many times Wall Street is funding the communists, how many times Rockefeller and Morgan are funding communists. Before you keep sitting here trying to argue with me and tell me, oh no, but really, bro, you got to stop saying that the left and the right are the same thing and there's something else bigger going on. Bro, it's right here. It's right here. Like, I'm not making this stuff up. It's not a fantasy like idea. It's a real thing. Don't you remember O'Brien from 1984? He was in charge of both the communist and the capitalist. And then when you went to switch over from one to the other, he was right there to give you the book for the other one. And then he would arrest you for being a traitor. During the whole period, for over 2 decades, Corliss Lamont, with the full support of his parents, was one of the chief figures in fellow traveler circles and one of the chief spokesmen for the Soviet point of view in both in these organizations and also in connections which came to him either as a son of the most influential man in Wall Street or as a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. His relationship with his parents may be reflected in a few events of this period. In January 1946, Corliss Lamont was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee to give testimony on the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship. He refused to produce records, was subpoenaed, refused, was charged with contempt of Congress, and was so cited by the House of Representatives on June 26, 1946. In the midst of this controversy in May, Corliss Lamont and his mother, Miss Thomas Lamont, presented their valuable collection of the works of Spinoza to Columbia University. The adverse publicity continued, yet when Thomas Lamont rewrote his will on January 6, 1948, Corliss Lamont remained in his so-called co-heir to his father's fortune of scores of millions of dollars. In 1951, the Subcommittee on Internal Security of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the so-called McCarran Committee, sought to show that China had been lost to the communists by the deliberate actions of a group of academic experts on the Far East and communist fellow travelers whose work in that direction was controlled and coordinated by the Institute of Pacific Relations. The influence of the communists in IPR is well established, but the patronage of Wall Street is less well known. The IPR was a private association of 10 independent national councils in 10 countries concerned with the affairs in the Pacific. The headquarters of the IPR and the American Council of the IPR were both in New York and were closely associated on an interlocking basis. Each spent about $2.5 million over the quarter century from 1925 to 1950, of which about half, in each case, came from the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundations, which were themselves interlocking groups controlled by an alliance of the Morgan and Rockefeller interest in Wall Street. Much of the rest, especially of the American Council, came from firms closely allied to these two Wall Street interests, such as Standard Oil, International Telephone and Telegraph, International General Electric, the National City Bank, and the Chase National Bank. In each case, about 10% of the income came from the sales and publications, and, of course, a certain amount came from ordinary members who paid $15 a year and received the periodicals of the IPR and its American Council, Pacific Affairs, and Far Eastern Survey. The financial deficits which occurred each year were picked up by the financial angels, almost all with close Wall Street connections. The chief identifiable contributions here were about $60,000 from Frederick Vanderbilt Field over 18 years, $14,700 from Thomas Lamont over 14 years, $800 from Corliss Lamont only after 1947, and $18,000 from a member, Lee Higson in Boston, who seems to have been Jerome D. Green. In addition, large sums of money each year were directed to private individuals for research and travel expenses from similar sources, chiefly the great financial foundations. Most of these awards for work in the Far Eastern area acquired approval or recommendation from members of IPR. Moreover, access to publication and recommendations to academic positions in the handful of great American universities concerned with the Far East required similar sponsorship. And finally, there can be little doubt that consultant jobs on Far Eastern matters in the State Department or other government agencies were largely restricted to IPR-approved people. The individuals who published, who had money, found jobs, were consulted, and who were appointed intermittently to government missions were those who were tolerant of the IPR line. The fact that all these lines of communication passed through the Ivy League universities or their scattered equivalents west of the Appalachians, such as Chicago, Stanford, or California, unquestionably went back to Morgan's influence in handling large academic endowments. All right. I'm going to stop it there. Okay, this other paragraph just gonna run over. Let me see if there's a. This chapter goes on forever. This is like the second to last chapter, I think. Jeez. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this chapter just keeps going on. All right, so this chapter is just showing how Wall Street basically infiltrated the media as early as like 1918, possibly earlier than that, and that they were using their money influence to install basically their own family members at the top of most of the prestigious organizations in the United States, including all the Ivy League colleges, the media organizations, politics, the arts, sciences, all their people. And everybody knew that if they went against the line, that they would get fired, that their publication would be destroyed, that their museum would be shut down. So these people had basically like full control of public opinion in the United States through their money, through their mafia-like conglomerates that basically were family centered. I mean, it's a mafia basically. It's like you had to be like related to them to even get into a position where you can be in one of these powerful controlling positions. And again, we can see the evidence over and over and over again to the fact that it's undeniable that the world's top capitalists were funding and promoting communists in the United States the whole time, even before McCarthyism. They were the ones that built up China. And it's like, look, I get the actual metaphysics of being a right winger or being a left winger. It's a political position. Sometimes it's a social position. Sometimes it's a historical position. But you cannot deny that these people are playing both sides. You just can't pretend, oh, where's the money? Oh, it's a real thing. Oh, they're not paying for it. It's like, bro, get out of here. Do some actual research. Stop just sitting there watching live streams for 10 hours a day and not doing any research. It's obvious that the communists are funded by the capitalists, because who else has money besides capitalists? Like, I can't listen to people who are actually stupid, who can't even put like 2 and 2 together. I can see like the convoluted conspiracy theory stuff where it's like, oh, this guy did this and you can't really prove it. But it's like, this is a publicly available college book. And everybody knows they've been playing both sides the whole time. But you just want people to desperately believe that there's some type of actual division going on and they're not just playing you. Because you're part of the playing people. You're just like, oh, wait, hold up. They're doing a scam. I'm just going to get in on the scam. I'm going to get in on the left-right divide scam and just rile people up. It's a bunch of bullshit. I'm sorry. It's as clear as day that the world's top capitalists, not just like some guy that's got a small business running or some guy that owns a factory. No, the world's top capitalists, the people that own the Bank for International Settlements, fund communism. Sorry. You cannot disprove that. You can't. I'm sorry. Well, anyway, thanks for watching the video if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. Have a good day and peace.